Hello and welcome to another episode of Butler's Babble, where we try to empower, motivate, and inspire you to live the best lives that you can live. And by do that, we bring on special guests in here to share their stories, show you how they've gotten through some of the bad times in their life and how they've made it through, and they're successful now, and they want to share their stories with you. So today we have an amazing guest, and just a reminder, we are recording this instead of live streaming again. This is our newer format, so we are going recording these ahead of time, but feel free to leave comments in the comment section. We'd love to hear what you have to say. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them. And I'm sure myself or our guests would be able to get back to you when we can and try and answer those questions. But we love to hear your comments, so make sure you send them. Today, we have an amazing young lady. She went through quite a bit growing up, stuff that you only hear about in movies usually, but this was actually real life. So she's going to share her story. She's coming to us live from Salt Lake City, Utah. So we're going to bring her in. Why don't we bring in Shanel? Shanel, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
No, we're glad that you came here, and we're humbled that you're willing to share your story with us. So give us a little background so everybody knows who you are. Give us a little background on Shanel, where you're from, things like that.
So my name is Shanel Bodero. I was born in California, lived there till I was about 5, and then we actually moved to Georgetown, Texas, which is about 20 minutes outside of Austin. So usually people know where Austin's at. And I grew up there until I was 19, and then moved to Utah shortly after. My family and I kind of had some changes right at the same time. I graduated high school, was going to college, and my father lost his job and was kind of moving to go do a different job. And so we both moved at the same time out of Texas, and I went to Idaho and they went to Oregon. And I planned on being here pretty short term. It wasn't supposed to be long term. But life happens, and ended up meeting my husband, now ex-husband. And we had 3 kids together. Now I'm divorced, and I just have so many roots here. I've been here for 15
Mhm.
years now, and I've got family, and my kids love it here. They've got their cousins, and so yeah, this is where I call home now, even though I do miss Texas a lot. But we're here. My roots are here right now, and we're just kind of, yeah, living life. I'm a
That's
master
awesome. I
esthetician.
know I know
Yeah.
what you're talking about because I grew up in a big city myself, just outside of Toronto. I was born in Toronto, Canada. Grew up about half an hour outside of Toronto, in a city called Brampton, and then I even moved. I lived there till my 30s, and then I moved to Edmonton, which is still another big city, on the
Mhm.
west side there. And same thing. I lived there for a while, and then I moved here, and I'm in a small town in Ontario, Canada now called Petawawa, and it's a military base area, and it's small. Like I'm used to the city life where you're.
Yeah.
That was where I was born, but this is my roots now. I've been here 16 years, love it here. So I know what you mean by you planned on it just being a short period of time, but it becomes your
Yeah.
home. So
Yeah, it was definitely not expected, and mine was the opposite. I came from a small town and then moved here, and it was so much bigger, and so now I'm definitely used to it, um but yeah, it's home now.
no, that's awesome. So so you get married there, you have your children, you set your life down there, and
Mhm.
then what happens from there?
I actually, I had children all in my 20s, and then when I hit 30, I actually decided to go back to school, and I got my aesthetics license, and so I'm
Okay.
a master esthetician. I also manage a spa, and I also teach, and so that was kind of once my kids were just a tiny bit older, I knew I was done having kids. I kind of decided I needed to do something for me. And so that's what I did. And I love my job. It's definitely a stepping stone for me.
Mhm.
My end goal, before I'm 50, when my kids are like out of the house, I actually would love to be a therapist. So my goal is to kind of go back to school and not really have a timeline for it, but just do it at my own pace, and get a master's in psychology and social work.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see that on your profile too. That you advanced waxing instructor. You got your
Yep.
master esthetician, an instructor at Skin Science Institute. So yeah, you did a lot to get yourself. I could see you being a good therapist too. So what people don't know too is this is actually just part one of an interview we're doing with you. We're actually going to do another part also that goes on another part of your life. But for this part of the story and this part of your life, why don't we go back then when you were a child? So, because this all starts
Yeah.
back when you were a child. Now that we know a bit about you, so you grew up in. I thought was this did this start off in California or was it when you were in Texas when all this started?
It definitely started in California, but I actually don't remember anything in California.
Because you were
Um,
too
my
young.
memories my memories don't really start. I do have one memory when I was about 2 and a half, which isn't really common. But most of my childhood memories are in Texas. They're not in California. So from the time I was about 5 or 6 and up.
Okay, so you're in
Yeah.
Texas and you're coming around that 4.5, 5 years old, and that's when a lot of the stuff starts to really hit the fan, as they say, I guess.
Yes. So I was born to a mother who had a very, very rough childhood. And her her coping mechanisms and her trauma and all of that kind of came out after she had me. It's actually really common as well. A lot of really severe mental trauma, mental illnesses, all of that, they kind of rear their ugly heads when a woman will have children or hit that kind of like peak age of like 25 to 30. And so that's kind of what happened. My mother and father, um, they got pregnant with me. They were already engaged. They got married. And after my mother had me, things kind of spiraled downward, at least from my mother and my father. My mom started showing signs of multiple personality disorder, which is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder. So DID. So when I refer to it as DID, that's what I mean.
Okay.
Um, and it just continued. My I do feel really bad for my dad, in some instances because he married someone thinking one thing, and he ended up getting something else. So
Mm,
he's been dealing with a lot when it comes to my mother's mental health ever since I was born, but that's not how he knew her before. So that causes a lot of mental awareness, and you're like, "Oh my god, what did I get into?" So I do have a little bit of empathy for my parents in that of it wasn't what they expected, and then they just had to deal with it, with a child. Um, but from my memories, my mom, from a very young age, I remember my mom having, as a child, you're going to call it moodiness. You're going to say her
okay.
moods just went up and down and all over the place. But really, they were just different alters. But as a child, I didn't know that. I just was like, "Oh, I know my mom's gonna get really angry because this happened." And then sometimes it would switch, and I'd be like, "Oh my god, she didn't get mad. What's happening?" And I have a memory of I was probably 7, and there's this big, huge potted plant in our house in our living room, real soil, all of that. And I accidentally knocked it over, and there was soil everywhere. And I instantly was like, "I am gonna get in so much trouble. I've caused such a mess." And I remember this is kind of one of the better memories I have. My mother came in and she looked at it, and I already knew I was preparing myself. She's gonna get so angry. And she just looked at me and she looked at the dirt on the carpet and she just said, "Oh, okay, let's just pick it up." And I remember at 7, I was like, who the hell are you? Like, it didn't make sense to me. I was
Whole different
relieved,
person.
but it didn't make sense to me. And as a 7-year-old, already thinking that and already knowing that there's something wrong, that it doesn't make sense, um, I just continued that. And so that was one of the better ones. I have another really good one where my mother was in this she had all of her alters kind of had their own personalities, their own way of speaking, their own way of handling things, all of that. And I had a project when I was about 8 or 9, and she just went all out. And she spent 3 days, and we made the most amazing dinosaur project ever. And I have really good memories like that. It's weird knowing that it wasn't my mother, it was an alter.
Mhm.
Because then I also have on the other end, I have of the spectrum, I have memories that are terrible that I
Mhm.
know were alters and not my mother as well.
Yeah.
Um, but growing up in a home where you don't ever quite know who you're coming home to is pretty exhausting.
Mhm. Yeah, and you and I
It's
talked about it in our pre-interview where it reminded me of that movie Split, for
yeah,
anybody who's seen
exactly.
that, and you told me that that
Mhm.
movie, of course, a lot of it is exaggerated a little bit for Hollywood, of course, but overall, the old premise
Absolutely.
and the way that he changed into these different things was pretty
Mhm.
accurate, you said.
It was very accurate. I watched it knowing already I'm very intrigued by this disorder. It's incredibly interesting. It's rare. It's something that I it's why I wanna go into psychology because it's so fascinating what the brain can do to help you survive. If no one on here knows why someone gets DID, you're not born with it. It is man-made. And it is in result to severe trauma and abuse in a short period of time when you're very young. That's why it's so rare. You can't just wake up one day and have DID. You're not born with it. You can't even really get it when you're an adult. It has to happen when you are a child, and
Okay.
your childlike brain is basically protecting you from that abuse. So your brain splits off and you have an alter that kind of comes forward and protects you from that abuse and that trauma. And then another one is split, and then another one is split. And so that is why it's created. Your brain basically is protecting you, but it
Okay.
is something that is very hard to live with moving forward. And so knowing that as a child, and bless my mother's heart, I do feel for her. She obviously went through a lot to even have this disorder. Um,
Mhm.
but being raised with it is something that no one really will ever understand or
Yeah.
know. Um, I was I was the child that had to take care of everything. I had to be the peacekeeper. I had to kind of make sure that nothing was too up here, nothing was too down here. We always kind of walked on eggshells because we didn't really know what would set her off or what would make her cry or what would make her angry or what would, we kind of just had to
Mhm.
make sure that everything was really smooth, which is impossible, but you try. Um, and yeah, so that kind of changes you as a child and how you grow up, because you're always taking care of someone else's mental health
Yeah.
as a
And
8-year-old.
and I can imagine, like, I take it your mom and dad were still together. They still together today?
Yes, they are
Yes.
still married.
So I can imagine how that is a toll on your dad too, because he's going
Oh,
through the same
yeah.
thing as you, but this is his wife, his mate, not his mom or something like that. So it's a whole different situation.
Yeah.
I'm sure he probably didn't know at night who he's going to bed with and who he's waking up with and what that kind of day is going to be like. And I'm sure he has
Yeah,
a full time job himself and worrying while he's
he
at work.
does.
Okay, who's at home right now? And I mean, it's got to take a toll on a marriage too.
Yeah, it really he sorry, my dog just barked. Um, he, Nukes. He bless his heart too. He has if you've ever heard of the term trauma bonding,
Okay.
um, I truly believe that's what he has. He is 100% trauma bonded to my mother. He doesn't know how to survive without her and that toxicity and that,
Mhm.
that just chaos all the time, never knowing.
Yeah.
That's his normal. He's
Okay.
been through some things that are pretty intense. I mean, he's I've heard stories of before I can remember finding my mother on the front lawn of someone else's house dressed in clothes that he's never seen. and is just like, who are you? What did you do? And she
Yeah.
has no memory of it. Um, so he's definitely been through some very weird, traumatic things where how do you handle that? It's definitely hard. I think he could have done things better, but I also think that when you don't know what you're doing already and you don't even know what this disorder is, how are you supposed to do it fully aware of the
Mhm.
correct and the incorrect way to handle things? Um, and yeah, I think I mean, I say this all the time. He probably needs therapy more than anybody, but I don't think he'll ever
Mhm.
get it. I think he just tries to be the strong one for my mother. Um, but he always puts her first. That's all he's ever done. And I think that's all he knows how to do is to put her first.
And plus, I think a lot of it too is he's got a young daughter there too that he's got to make sure is taken care of too. And
Yeah.
so I guess there was a big bond between you and your dad, I'm sure, because you two are sort of competing against this together.
Well, it was an interesting dynamic growing up because my mother, I was her number 1, not my dad. I was her number 1, I was her main concern. It was very much in an unhealthy way, uh, and for my dad, my mother was his number 1, I was not. So, there's definitely it was like a weird triangle dynamic, and there's actually a term I learned this in therapy a couple years ago. There is this term called, emotional incest, and basically what that means is one parent treats their child how they would a spouse.
Okay.
So that's what my mother did to me. So we kind of had this weird emotional incest where I was involved in very mature adult conversations and emotions as a child because I was her number 1, and she used to tell me that, like, that's come out of her mouth. But
Mhm.
for my dad, she was his number 1. So I had one parent putting me up here on this pedestal, and then I had another parent where I was second all the time. It was
Mhm.
very confusing as a child, and very unhealthy in the sense of boundaries. There was never any boundaries. Um, and my mother was a very, very strong-willed person. So that term, like, she wears the pants in the family, she did. She
Mhm.
controlled everything. My dad worked. He had a great career. He did all of that. He made sure there was food on the table, all of that. But when it came to the dynamics of our household, my mother was in charge all the time, no matter
Okay.
what. Um, so when you have that inconsistency of someone always in charge, but that person changes constantly,
Mhm.
it's very emotional and very up and down. I actually remember as a teenager, my mother decided to get these colored flags. So it'd be like a red flag and a yellow flag and a blue flag, and they
Mhm.
each represented a different mood or a
Okay.
different altar, and she would put them in the plant in the front of our house to try and let us know what we were walking into.
Okay. So
It's
did
just sometimes I think about it and I'm like, wow.
so going back to that movie Split I was talking about, one thing
Yeah.
that I noticed with this gentleman was um, he knew even when he was a different personality, he still knew inside himself what was going on. So like if they were
Yes.
saying to the one like the look that was like a little child kind of personality, or if it was the nurturing personality and saying, well, why don't you just let us go? And they're like, no, because he'll if he comes back, he's gonna know and then we're
Yes.
gonna get in trouble and things like that. Almost like they were talking as if they were a family, these other personalities. They all lived together and they knew about each other. Now, was your
Yes.
mom that she was still cognizant of all these other personalities? Now, did she treat it like they were separate people, or did she treat it like she knew it was all in her own mind? Do you know what I'm getting at? Like, some people
Yeah,
might think that they
absolutely.
can't distinguish if this is real or if that's 10 different people that live in my house with me, or it's all in my mind. I just don't know who I'm going to be that day.
It's very much like in that movie Split, where there's kind of one altar that kind of controls everybody, that is very real. That is very, accurate, and there usually is one altar that kind of runs the show, and you mentioned in the same house, like 10 people in the same house. That's a really good analogy, as if your brain is a house and they each you have a long hallway, and there's 10 different doors. Each altar has their own door, but usually, depending on the situation the person is in, one altar will come forward. They all have their role, they all have their
Mhm.
purpose. So there's an altar that takes over, sexual trauma. There's an altar that takes over motherhood. There's an altar that takes over confrontation. There's an altar, and they all have their own type of personality. It's why I remember my mother being really fun. She had an altar that was so fun and spontaneous. She also had an altar that was mean, just mean and conniving and just evil. She had another altar that was very childlike. She also had an altar that was a therapist and was very good at, like, talking people down. He was the one that was kind of in charge. He kind of knew all the altars, he kinda knew what their purpose was, and it very much is like that. She had moments where she had no memory, but for the most part, it was very much she knew they had a purpose and she loved them. They all
Mhm.
have they're all kind of like a family in there. And it's very hard to kind of wrap your head around that like you can have that in your brain. But they're very much individual people. They are individual personalities. And they have a role and they have a purpose, and their entire purpose is in their mind to protect the person they are in.
Mhm.
um and so sometimes the person outside, like me, doesn't understand it, but to them, in that one brain, they all have a reason, and they come out to protect Kim. That's my mother's name, Kim. They come out to protect her, whether we
Mhm.
understand it or not.
And you brought up a good point there. You were saying about how, like, the one's childlike, the one's nurturing, and then you said the one was a therapist, and then you
Yeah.
said he thought this or
Mhm.
he thought that, which brings up a good point because just because Kim is a female does not mean all those personalities were female personalities. Now, did she
No.
portray them outside as female and male, such as clothing, things like that? Or did she just still dress normally, but when he came out, he just she spoke as if she was a he, but she was still wearing her normal female clothing, or did
No,
she change into male clothing?
no, she didn't change her appearance.
Okay.
Granted, there were times where I have been told that, you know, for I mean, this is real, but, like, you have an altar that's very promiscuous. I'll just say
Mhm.
that word. And she would dress the part. She would dress the part for that. But for most of my childhood, I never saw changes in her appearance. She
Okay.
always portrayed herself very put together. She dressed very well. She always had her hair done, and she always had her makeup done, and she was very put together. And a lot of that I truly believe is because um she was already quite manipulative, in the sense that no one would truly believe that she had this disorder unless you lived with her. And she was very good at putting on a good face. And so she did. I mean, I remember growing up and people were like, "Oh my god, she just the most beautiful wardrobe, and she's always put together, and she's so intelligent, and she all of these things." But behind closed doors, you would never see that she laid in bed for 6 hours at a time because she couldn't get up.
Mhm.
And, that kind of thing. She screamed into a pillow every morning because she was so frustrated with how she had to live her life. Like, no one saw that unless you lived in the house with her.
Mhm.
Um, so she was very good at hiding what she could and making it look like everything was fine.
So that these personalities, these multiple, and I think you and I talked about it before. I asked you last week or whatever, how many you think, and you said that as far as you guys know, you've been able to come up with about 14 different ones. Now, when it
Mhm.
comes to those personalities, did they always seem to come out at home, or did this happen away from home too? Like when you're out somewhere, if she sees somebody you're at a soccer game. I'm not saying you play soccer, but say you were playing a soccer game
Yeah.
and somebody's coming up and they trip you, or they're checking you, or just coming home from school and she sees somebody bullying you and stuff. Did one of these other personalities come out to try and protect you, or was this more something that happened at home all the time?
No, she definitely she could never really control it if it came out in public. However, if you didn't know she had this disorder, you probably wouldn't notice.
Okay.
The whole purpose of these altars is to protect her, so they also are very aware of what they can and cannot do in public. Yes, if you know, like, very specifically and personally her disorder, I would be able to tell you, "Oh, she just switched. That's not kin, that's an alter."
Hmm.
I could tell that. Nobody else would if they didn't know it. They might say, "Oh, she's just in a really good mood today," or, "Oh, she's like something's wrong. She's PMSing," or whatever it is. They would be
Hmm.
able to maybe tell that her mood was off or her mood would change, but her voice never changed. Her her clothing never changed. It was just very much like you wanted to be around her because she was exciting. Because you never for people who don't live with her, it was kind of this like she was very charming and she had a way of talking to people and she had a way of bringing them in and being the life of the party. And a lot of that was because she had her alter changes and she wasn't this like boring, consistent person. She
Hmm.
had this way of really engaging. And so on the outside, no, I don't think people didn't know. People wouldn't have seen it or recognized it, but I could. And a lot of that does have to do with how she acted at home. If she didn't cook dinner, I knew something was wrong. If her room was a mess, I knew something was wrong. If she was very OCD and proactive, I knew that something was wrong. So it kind of went both ways. I could pick up on her little quirks of, okay, that's not her. I like that, but it's not her. Or, oh my
Hmm.
God, we have to deal with this and that's not her. I could pinpoint. And I was really good
Okay.
about that. And I was actually a lot better at that than my own dad. He didn't
Mm.
even pick up on those things. I did.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
um, with all these personalities out of the 14, of course, one of those personalities
Mhm.
was her normal, natural, who she really was. The other 13 were the protectors and things like that. Do
Mhm.
you was it easy to know when it was her and not one of the personalities? And if so, and I know some of my questions are probably really off the wall there, but it's just a matter of
No, I
I'm
love
very
them.
ignorant. I'm very ignorant to
Yeah.
this situation, as I'm sure most people listening to this will be. So I'm just trying to find out. But when it was her, was it her more often, and then these personalities just came out when some sort of thing happened, or were there times where she herself was gone for maybe a week or two because something in the life happened and these other ones came out and she couldn't break back through again for another week or two until things settled down? Has it ever been like that, or is it always usually at least once a day or every day she does come back to herself, or she started as herself, these other ones took over and things like that? Does she go to bed as herself? And they're weird questions, but I'm just curious on how that all happened
Yeah.
and worked.
No, it's there's so many questions like that. You're like, "Wait a minute." There's all these little things. You're like, "How does that really play into it?" As a child, I don't actually know. I think as a child, I knew she was very open. She had no filter. So I knew she had this disorder. Um, but as a child, I don't really know what was and wasn't her. I have memories of where I'm like, yep, I know that's not her. But overall, I couldn't really tell as a child, like, not all the time. I had specific moments where I could be like, "Yep, that's really obvious." But as just normal day to day, I actually can't answer that. I don't know. Um, Moving into adulthood, though, she was definitely more open to me about saying, "Yep, Kim is checked out." That's how it would come out. You're
Okay.
She would look at me or over the phone and say, "Kim is checked out. She's not here right now." Um, and I knew it was an alter because she told me it was an alter,
Yeah.
or the alter told me it was an alter. There were times as well where I was blamed for it. Um, I would date a boy she didn't like, or I would make a decision she didn't like, and it would it would spiral downward into I triggered her, and then this is what happened, and she felt this, and now she's dissociated. She's gone. She's locked in a room, and it's my fault that she's dissociated. So as I got older, she got her and her alters got more, I guess, sassy in the sense
Mhm.
of telling me where she was at, why they were out. It was my fault. It wasn't my fault. Things like that.
Okay. Okay. And
So
one thing I'd like to get to in a second here is you as a child growing up and dealing with that with friends and stuff like that. We'll get to that, but you just brought up a point that made me think. Like she would sit there and say, "Okay, Kim's checked out." Now, did these other alter egos have different names, or did they just go by um, Kim's locked out now, but they just talked to you? They never told you if they had a name of their own, or did they take on names of their own since they had different personalities?
that's a great question. Um, Growing up, they never had names, but they had faces. And so she would explain to me what they looked like. Um, and one second. I apologize.
No,
Um,
and we can cut it
so
right there, and then we'll bring it back in again. So you could just
okay.
start right from there. Okay.
Um, so as a child, explained to me that they had faces and they looked differently. So specifically remember her telling me that she had alters that were twins, little girls, and they were in white dresses, but they had no faces. Um, and then I remember her telling me that there was an altar that was a male, and he dressed really fun and really kind of like out there. And it, as an adult, it makes more sense because I can put it all together and be like, okay, well, I know that her wardrobe came from that, and I know that her, like it all kind
Yeah,
of made sense.
sure.
But they didn't have names when I was growing up, but they did have names when I became an adult.
Okay.
And they kind of came up. Yeah, their names kind of came up, and actually, I was an only child till I was 15, and so my younger sister, this goes into like her trauma, but she actually named them.
Oh, okay.
So they have names because of her.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so they, and as I got older and as my mother got older, her disorder became worse.
Okay.
So when it was at its worst, I was already like 19, 20 years old, and then my younger sister was like 6.
Yeah.
So we have very different experiences. But yeah, they did eventually have names. But when
Okay.
I was a child, they just had appearances, and like she would explain how they looked at their faces.
Okay. So when she
Yeah.
explained them and told you what they looked, that's probably just that was her sitting there talking to you. So you
Yeah.
and I'm sure your husband or your husband, that made no sense. Your dad, her
Yeah.
husband, probably was able to see when it was her a lot easier than you would because he knew her before
Yeah.
a lot of this
Um,
happened because
I think it's interesting. I actually don't think so. Um,
okay.
I
Do you
he
think they
kind
met while
of
she was going through this, so he doesn't know really
Oh,
who it
yeah.
was he was dating?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
I just don't think either one of them knew, and so there was no way for him to know or her to know
Okay.
that it was a disorder. It
Okay.
was just she was this really fun person that was like he always joked that he was really boring and that he is boring, and so I think it was kind of that opposites attract
Okay.
where
Yep.
he really liked the fact that she brought some of that spice to his life, and she liked that he kind of was consistent and he was
Okay.
just always there, not really moody. There was definitely opposites attract there. And so, yeah, she definitely had her symptoms and she definitely had her alters already. It just, they didn't kind of make rear their ugly heads to where it was really kind of like, what is going on? until
Mhm.
after she had me.
Okay. No, it makes sense.
So,
And so
yeah.
going back then to you as from 5 years old up until your
Mhm.
20s, wherever, when you're finally going to school and that, it had to have been sort of rough with you when it came to classmates, personal friends, bringing them home to hang out. Like, was it the type of thing where you just didn't want to bring them home because you didn't know who was going to be at home when they got there? Is it type, and you mentioned earlier about dating, and if the one person I didn't like who you were dating, they let you know and it was all your fault when they were coming out and things like that. Like, it had to be a rough in a sense of having a personal life, whether it be um, just with normal friends or even romantically. It had to be hard on you in that way.
Yes, it was. I'm actually still my best friend growing up, she's still in my life, and so she actually it's funny, we were talking about this about a year ago, she actually has a better memory of my childhood than I do.
Hmm.
And she's able to tell me things where I'm like, "Wait, really? That happened?" She's like, "Yes, it happened." Um, I My friend and her family were actually my saving grace. I feel like as a teenager, they made my teenage years memorable.
Okay.
Because you're right, I did not really like to bring people home. I always went to her house. I always went somewhere else. I never really had people come over. My mother was not the block mom. She was not the type that liked, noise. She didn't want chaos in the house. She was the only one that could produce the chaos, no one else,
Okay.
you know?
Yeah.
So it was very quiet in my house. If the music was too loud, she would get angry. Things had to be in their place. And so I mean, my friend would come over occasionally and she'll tell me, she's like, "Yeah, I just never really knew what would happen if I
Hmm.
came over." Um, and so dating, that was definitely an interesting dynamic. I have memories where my mother was very involved and was really excited about me dating. And then there would be memories where I'm like, "Oh my god, that is just so traumatic. Like, why would you do that?" And it's funny too because like I said, my mother wore the pants in the family. So normally in a household, when you have a daughter, this I feel like this is pretty average. The father, so you, when
Yeah.
your daughters are dating, you kind of come in and you're the protector. You're like, "This is my
Yes.
daughter. You need to take care of her. You need to do
Exactly.
this. You need to do this." My dad would leave. He would go sit in his bedroom. If I ever brought a boy over, he was not involved. It
Because
was
you knew your
just
mom
my
would take
mother.
over.
My mother just took over. And this is something that as a teenager, I tried to laugh it off, but it actually definitely embarrassed me. Um, but anytime I brought a boy home, I'll tell this story. So my mother grew up on a farm, and so she had to do some pretty crazy things on a farm. And one of them was castrating rabbits. And
Okay.
she has a huge, long white scar on her arm right here, really big. You can't not notice it. And when I would bring boys home, first time they would like shake her hand, and she'd grab onto their hand really hard, and she'd show them the scar, and she would
Hmm.
say, "You hurt my daughter. This is from castrating rabbits. That's not much different from a man to, or from a rabbit to a man." Every time I would bring a boy home and I would be like, "Oh my god, like, I this is a first date, we're not getting married." Like, I don't even yeah, so that would happen every single time. She would judge them on their handshake, she was very almost kind of like interrogating them.
Hmm.
And yeah, my dad would just go into his room, wouldn't say a word. Even when I got engaged, I've been engaged twice, married once. Even when I got engaged, he never asked, like, to be around him. He never asked how he was. He never asked if I was happy. He very much removed himself from anything of that because she just always inserted herself
Yeah.
and he just thought that would be fine. Um,
Mhm.
and she did. She took that role very seriously in a very unhealthy way where she'd call up my boyfriends without me even knowing. And
Mm.
she would just talk to them for hours. Or
Really?
she would Yeah, I dated one boy and a man, I was 20. Um, Literally told him after 3 months of dating that she was gonna buy him a wedding ring so he could propose to me. Let's just scare off all the men. So, yeah, it definitely was very unhealthy. There was no
Yeah.
boundaries at all, and she just inserted herself in every relationship I ever had, and tried to control it.
So I'm sure a lot of times, whether it be with new meeting new friends at school or going out with your friends to wherever party stuff and meeting new people or dating new guys, it would have, I guess, get to a point where you wanted to, you'd probably do stuff away from home without her knowing till you got closer to these people to know that, okay, just so you know, if you ever come to my house, this is what you're going to be up against. Did you have to explain it to people or did you just let it happen and then just sort of answer the questions as they came?
I definitely prepared any of the boys I brought home to
Mhm.
meet them. I didn't have a ton of girlfriends outside of my one friend named Sarah. She was my only one, and she grew up with me from the time I was 13 up.
So she was
So
used to it.
my mother knew her. She knew who, yeah, she knew my parents. I was always at her house. That was all very, there was really no explaining that needed to be done. Um, but I didn't really bring other people home. It was
Mhm.
the guys would come over occasionally if they were going to take me on a date and they just had to meet her. But I will say that I got really, really good at lying. It
Yeah.
was something that I felt was easier to do, so I did a lot of things outside of the house that they have no idea about. I was a really good kid. Like, I did
Yeah.
not do drugs, I was not drinking, I was not doing anything like that. I never even actually snuck out in the middle of the
Mhm.
night or anything to that extent, but where I was going, they I was such a good kid that they always had a lot of trust in me, and they didn't think that I would do anything bad. Um, and so I just got really good at lying about where I
Mhm.
was, who I was with, because that was easier than having
Yeah.
to tell them and then have to go through a whole meeting and have to explain how I know them and,
Yeah.
all of that. So I did. I got really good at lying.
And did it ever get to the point when you talk about that, whether it be a boyfriend or a girlfriend or your friend, was it Sarah you said? Um,
Mhm.
where out of those 14 personalities that you know of, you would have a split there where some thought that she is awesome or this gentleman is awesome, but the
Oh,
other
yeah.
ones did not like them. And then there's like an internal battle between them, and you got to deal with that.
Yes. So that very much happened. I feel like when my friend was around, when Sarah was around, or if she did like who I was with, she was very much the fun, "Oh my god, your mom is so cool," and, "Wow, I really like your mom." But she didn't like you, then it was like, "You don't wanna be around her, we don't wanna have to deal with this, like, I promise you, it's not fun." Um, but that didn't really happen until I met my ex-husband.
Okay.
So when I met my ex-husband, that is when I really truly saw how up and down and unhealthy her boundaries were. They were just
Yeah.
non-existent, and she was very vocal about it, and it put me in the middle a lot,
Mhm.
because even though he is my ex-husband now, he he did have some boundaries in that sense where he was like, "No." He would stand up to her and say, "No, I'm not
Yeah.
doing that." And she would, oh my god, lose her mind. And it turned into a huge ordeal when it didn't need to be, but I was stuck in the middle. So I was
Yeah.
going back and forth between her and my husband and and it caused so much stress and chaos in my marriage and my relationship with her. Um, because I didn't know what a normal, healthy relationship was with a parent and an adult child. I
Mhm.
was still very much treated like I was 10
Yeah.
and I didn't know how to get out of that.
And was it ever, um, how do I say this? When you're with her at one point and say she's the perfect nurturing person, or even just your normal mom, and then
Mhm.
would it just like on a just like that just turn into somebody different, or is it like she could be just standing there and a friend comes over and all of a sudden boom, there's a new personality? Did you see them change right in front of your eyes? And also, you say sometimes how some would be like, oh, this person's awesome, I love Sarah, I think she's awesome, but then the other one's like, no, there's something wrong. Would she have internal arguments with herself in front of you, or is this more internally in her brain that she would be having these? It sounds really
If someone
complicated,
else
I
was
know.
around, no, it when someone else was around, it was never in public, but she would have the conversations with me, like, if it was just
Okay.
me and her,
Yeah.
um, and I have seen her switch instantaneously, I have seen that, granted, that was more when I was older and I was more aware of
Okay.
who her alters were, all of that, um, I've had, uh I've had instances where I have seen her change and I knew she changed, but no one else did. And I could tell
Okay.
her demeanor and her behavior had changed. And I'm the one that had to be like, Dad, leave her alone. Or Dad, stop talking. Or, just let her go and let her do this. Like, just let her be. I could see it, but no one else could.
Yeah.
So I was very in tune with, as I got older, if she changed, if an alter came forward, which is what they call it, like an alter comes forward and they're the ones that's
Yes.
presenting themselves. Um, and so I could see it. So in the movie Split, you'll
Yeah.
see that he kind of like cracks his neck a little bit, like,
Okay.
and
Yeah. I
it
remember
you can
that.
kind of tell in his eyes. My mother did that a lot, actually. I could tell, like,
Oh, okay. It's
she would
almost like
kind of
flicking
like,
a
yeah, it would
switch.
be this. Very much. It could be very much like clicking a switch, and the more comfortable she was with you, the more open she would be about not hiding her switches. So,
Okay.
um, like, as a child, I think it was hidden a lot more, and people in church or people in her workplace, she hid it a lot more, and her alters knew that. They knew that they couldn't just all of a sudden be like a whole different person, and people are gonna be like, "What the hell is happening?"
Yeah.
But in home and in front of people that she was very comfortable with that already knew she was struggling with this, she was a little bit more at ease with how her switches appeared and how quickly they appeared and how drastic they appeared. And I've flat out had interviews with these alters where I have watched in real motion, like real time, them switch, and her whole entire demeanor changes. And all of a sudden, she has a very straight posture, or it changes and she kind of gets like lazy and loopy, and like her whole body kind of moves differently, than
Mhm.
it did 2 seconds ago. Um, her voice doesn't change, but her dialect and, like, how she speaks and, everyone's tones and all of that, how quick you talk, how slow you talk, all of that, I've watched that change, right in front of me, and so that's definitely a very weird, interesting type of
I
dynamic to
imagine.
see in someone.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so when I watch those movies, I analyze them and I think, okay, how accurate is that? How Hollywood is it? Um, and there's quite a few of them out there that get it pretty right on the money.
Yeah, because I'm sure that they're based off of something like your type of a mother
Yeah.
that people have known, and that's what they wrote it from. And that, and like you said, you've got to figure out which part is Hollywood too, because they're going to try and make
Yeah.
it so that people want to watch the movie and that. So, um, but
Yeah.
now, have you ever? I know we're coming up to close to an hour, but we still got some time here. Um, Talking about like her changing back and forth, and she's telling you what they look like inside of her. Have you ever
Mhm.
been like, say, in one room, and in the other room you can hear her sort of talking to herself, almost like she's talking from one person out to the other, or is it just in her brain she's talking to him? That's not out verbal. It's just in her brain. She's sort of communicating with them. Like, can she communicate with the other ones while she's in there, or is it more just external? Like, oh, you don't want to do that, or else he's going to come, or she's going to come out, or things like that, or is it more can she actually communicate with the other ones inside, or is it when one's out there The other ones are just, like you said, in their doors in the hallway, and they don't come out unless they have to.
Um, they definitely communicate. They definitely know what they need to be doing. She doesn't I've never seen her as if she was talking to 2 people or as if she was
Mhm.
talking to someone else in the room. I've never
Okay.
seen that. She's never done that, but I have had alters refer to her to me. So, I have looked at her and an alter will come forward and, um, she'll say, "Kim is gone right now. She can't talk, but you're Chanel, right? I think
Okay.
Kim likes you." Like, I've had that literally said to
Okay.
me to my face of, "You're Chanel, though. I think Kim likes you. She's talked about you before." So they definitely communicate. But the thing with DID is that Kim, the initial person, is not in
Mhm.
control. They're
Yeah.
not in control. They are very much almost as if they are their own alter, and there is another alter that is kind of controlling it. And that would be the therapist alter.
Mhm.
She explained it one time actually as a pyramid,
Okay.
and the top of the pyramid was the strongest altars. And sometimes they would swap. It would be like a therapist, and it would be this other woman who, excuse my language, but was just a bitch. She was
Yeah.
just mean and she was very controlling and she could pretty much do whatever she wanted. And those two would kind of swap in the power role of I can control
Okay.
everything else. Other ones would come forward more, but those two would swap in I'm in control of everything. Um,
Exactly.
and the therapist has talked to me before and said, "Yeah, so this is why this person's here, and this is why this person's here, and that person's no longer alive. We killed that person off. That person's dead. Um, if this happens, this is what's going to happen next." Um, and he's flat out told me that if they go to therapy and they do what's called fusion therapy, or at least it used to be called fusion therapy, where they kind of combine all of the alters into one person. So
Uh-huh.
instead of having it all split off, they kind of all go back together, that it will kill her. That will kill her. She can't have all of these alters disappear because then she'll die. Um, and it's very much almost like their own little tiny government. Like they all have a
Okay.
purpose, they all have a role,
Yep.
there's someone
Their
in
own
charge,
community.
their own little community in there, but Kim is not in control. Um,
Okay.
they're all trying to protect her, so they do
Mhm.
what they need to do to protect her, and she's not necessarily in control. Now, she's had her moments where she's explained to me that she has been in control a little bit, but not nearly enough. Not enough to actually say that Kim can control her alters because she couldn't.
Mhm. Okay. So when she's talking to you and she's saying, "Well, no, it's Kim right now," you know it's your real mom.
Mm.
But
And I've
when these
actually
other ones
never
come
had her
out,
say that.
"Oh, no?"
I've never had her say that before. It's never been, "Oh, I'm Kim, I'm your mom." It's
Yeah.
always been another alter telling me that it's not Kim,
Okay. So
which
usually
is
when that
is
happens,
interesting.
it probably was Kim, and then now that they've said that, it's like, okay, she's checked out now,
Yep.
because she was here, and it's probably like you said, they have that hierarchy, whether it was the
Mhm.
therapist or that other female, and they're probably saying, like when something happens that is very sad to her, they're like, okay, it's your turn to go. Or if
Yes.
somebody's being really to the point where she's going to get pissed off and mean, that's when the other one will say, okay, it's your turn now, or I'm going in there now. So they probably, like you said,
Yep.
internally are telling each other, okay, this is who's going out there. And it does sound like something just out of a movie. And people, I don't think, realize that this is real life. This really does
It
happen.
is. The best way that everyone's kind of seen this movie, but have you ever seen Inside Out, the cartoon?
The cartoon, yes. Yeah,
Where they're
with the
all
ones in the
sitting at the
brain there, yeah.
panel? Yeah, where they're all sitting at the panel and they all are a different emotion. There's anger, there's joy, there's sadness.
Hmm.
That is kind of my best in childlike terms to
Yeah.
explain alters. They are watching what is happening with that little girl in that movie, and they're like, "Oh, it's time for joy to come out. Oh, it's
Yeah.
time for anger to come out. Oh, it's time for
Okay.
sadness."
That's a
That's
great way to
kind
put it.
of that's a really good, like, childlike version of the way that
Yep.
I can explain it. if anybody is really curious though to kind of know exactly what it's like and what I have it's been explained to me by my mother, there's a show right now called The Crowded Room. It just ended. And I suggest if anybody's ever really curious about this disorder and like how it works internally, watch that show. Um, I have never seen anything on TV or on film that explained the inner workings of the disease like that show did. It showed
Okay.
it so accurately. I actually cried the entire episode because I was just like, "Oh my god, this has been explained to me, but I've never seen it, like,
Hmm.
visually," and it was showing it visually, where I'm like,
Okay.
That's been told to me. That is how it was explained to me coming from someone with DID." Like, that
Yeah.
is crazy that they were able to put it in such a good way on film. So if
Mhm.
anybody ever is curious, I suggest you watch that show because that is by far the most accurate thing I've ever seen
Okay.
regarding the disease or the disorder.
Has there ever been a time where you really wanted to say something? Doesn't it could be emotionally, it could be just you want to talk to your mom or something, and you went right up to her and said, "I want to talk to so and so. I need to talk to this person. Is this person available that I can talk to them?" Has it
Um,
ever been a communication like that?
only when I about 7 years ago, I actually interviewed her alters. And so that's the only time that's ever happened where I really saw them individually, um, and they allowed me to see them individually. So
Okay.
I spent about a week trying to get proof in writing for my mother to get her psychiatric help. And sadly, with this disorder, not many people believe it, even professionals. They think it's fake.
Mhm.
Um, and she's really good about hiding it too. So you bring her in and they're like, oh, she's fine, you know.
Yeah.
So I had to spend about a week interviewing these alters and I had to talk to the therapist alter and basically explain what I was doing. And
Mhm.
he had to then give other alters permission to come forward and speak to me.
Okay.
And so that was when I was able to say, okay, thank you, sir. Like, I can't remember his name, to be honest,
Yeah.
but the therapist, I would say, thank you for speaking with me. I need to speak to this person now. I need to speak to this person now. And I would write it all down. And that's when I would get the conversations that were really hard to hear, but I knew I
Yes.
needed to do it of, oh, wait, I recognize you. You're Chanel. You're Kim's daughter, right? But
Yeah.
it's your mother saying that to you, which is
Exactly.
just so mind boggling.
And were you recording
Um,
this?
no, I should have, but I don't know if they would have allowed it. I don't know if they would have let
Mhm.
me do it. They knew I was writing it down. They knew I was writing stuff and they were okay with
Yeah.
it. They would be like, "You can
Okay.
write that down. You can write
Yeah.
that down." And then there would be times where I had to really be assertive. I would do this about 4 hours every day for a week. And one day I walked into her room and I said, "Okay, are we ready to talk?" And she had her really mean alter come out
Mhm.
and she just started yelling at me. And I had to just be like, "You can sit down. You can stop. You can sit down. I am not your daughter right now. I am trying to get you help." And it was very interesting because this specific alter had no concept of time. So the reason she was so angry at me was because she thought I had abandoned her for 3 days,
Uh,
but really it had been 3 hours.
really?
And so I had to sit down and be like, "Go look at the time. It's 11 AM. I was in here 3 hours ago." Like, and I had to explain that, and she ended up calming down, and then we were able to kind of move into our interview, I guess,
Yeah.
and continue to talk. And that's where I got a lot of the information, and I got a lot of the one-on-one, where I knew specifically who I was talking to, and it was very much a which is also in the show The Crowded Room, you see this type of dynamic in that show as well. Where yeah, I was specifically saying, "I need to talk to this person." Okay, they would come forward, I would see it, her whole body would kind of change, her eyes would change, and we would talk, and then I would ask someone else to come forward. And it was very yeah, it was very, like, organized. in a very
Okay.
weird way.
No, that's good though. You were able to get a lot of that out and get
I
more
was.
perspective on it that way, I'm sure. Are
Yes.
you and your mom still close today? Do you still talk a lot or?
No, actually, after that time of interviewing her and getting her psychiatric help, afterwards, I ended up cutting contact, and I haven't spoken to her since. So that was 7
Okay.
years ago. There's a lot of things that led up to that of toxicity of I mean, I could list a whole book, but,
Mhm.
she stole my identity. She conned me out of money. She blamed me for things that I had nothing to do with. She meddled in my marriage. She a lot of just, like, little things all
Yeah,
throughout that caused a lot of drama and chaos and guilt and shame. And so over time, I had kind of built up this tolerance for it. Then I became a mother, which then changes your whole outlook on things.
sure.
And then 2 years later was when I was helping her get psychiatric help, and that was kind of my goodbye. It was
Yeah,
like, "This was me helping you. I got you
yeah.
a therapist, I got you into a hospital," and afterwards, she yelled at me and blamed me for causing her so much trauma, and I just
Yeah.
said, "I'm done. Bye,"
You basically
and I
pass the torch
closed
off to somebody else
I
now and let them
passed it
deal with
off
it.
and I
Yeah.
said, "You can now go to my dad. You can now
I'm sure
my
you had
father
to
can
do this for
handle
your own
this."
sanity too, because there's only so
Yep.
much you can take. And then if you, like you said, you have
Yeah.
daughters now, you were married at the time. I mean, there's only so much you can take until you got to start thinking, you know what, I got to think about me and my family. So
Yes.
I can totally
Absolutely.
understand that. And I have two daughters myself, and I know life changes once you have kids. I mean, your whole
It
perspective on
really
life and
does.
things that happen, it does change. But I'm totally humbled, like I said at the beginning, that you've come to tell because it's not an easy story. I'm sure to tell. I'm sure you've got a book in here. You could probably write a novel on just your
I
growing
really
up.
want to one day.
Well, you let me know because I have somebody who could help you with that if you ever want to. And I do
I
one of
love
our
that.
past guests that can do something like that. So we'll definitely get you in touch if that's something you ever want to do, of course. But I'm probably going to end it there because we could probably sit here for hours and just talk back and forth.
Yeah,
And
we
and I'm
could.
totally intrigued about it. Um, and I know like some of my questions came off probably kind of very ignorant, and it's because I am ignorant about this subject. It's something that's not out there to the
Most
common person.
most people are, and that's
Mhm.
why I think this is so helpful, because I didn't have anything like this, and I wish I
Mhm.
had. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, everybody is ignorant. It's such a rare disorder that no one really knows what it is, and if you
Yeah.
do see it, you see it in a movie.
Yep. Especially when you said
So,
like they're very your mom was very good at keeping it at home because even out in the public, even if something was changing, it was done in a way that nobody could really tell or that they could have made, like you said, it's a mood swing. Oh, she's just going through a mood swing. She's having a
mhm.
bad day or something. That's why she's like
Yes.
not knowing what you know. So I'm sure like it is something that I bet you goes on a little bit more often than people think. And some
Yeah.
people don't realize it like you guys were able to find out. I'm sure some families are going through it that still don't realize it's happening and they've been doing it
Yeah.
all their life and just think that their parent's going through a mood swing or their child. It could be a parent dealing with a child going through this. So, because like you said, it usually starts. I was very intrigued in the way that you said you can't be born with it and you can't
No.
just get it. It's something that over time from some sort of trauma that actually causes this to happen. That's good to know because I think a lot of people think, oh, they were probably born with this or, oh, they're
Mm-mm.
just faking it and things like that. So I'm glad that you were able to come on, explain it to people. Um, if anybody's interested in leaving some questions in the question area there, by all means do it because I'm sure Chanel's would be willing to answer as
Yeah.
best as she can. Um, I'm totally flabbergasted you came on here. I really appreciate it. I love getting to know you a little bit more. And you and I had a really good talk last week too. And I'm what people don't realize, or I mentioned it earlier, is we are going to come back with a part two of a different part of your life that happens basically from. It's almost like going to take off from right where we ended there and go
Mhm.
a little step further. And there's some reasons
Yeah.
why we haven't talked about it today, but definitely going to get you to come back on if we can and have you talk about that. We don't know when yet because it depends on certain circumstances that you were telling me about. So I'm glad you came on, and I'm more than welcome to look at your other story and let people hear about that because, like I said, I'm just amazed at how um, amazing you've turned out, because somebody that went through what you went through growing up, and then some of the other stuff you've gone through, to be so level-headed and just the way you are. And I'm proud of the person that you've actually grown up to be, because that wasn't easy, I'm sure. So thank you for coming on and joining us today. Now, before we
Thank
leave, I
you.
always ask my guests, do you have any last words you would like to tell the viewers about anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I would say that anybody who is currently or in the past struggling with someone close to them that is suffering from mental illness or disorders, or even if it's like narcissism or severe manipulation or anything like that, it's really hard to not blame yourself. And it's really hard to not say that you're part of it.
Mhm.
But I'm here to tell you that you're not. It's not a reflection of you, how someone treats you, it's a reflection of them. And what you can't control what they do, but you can control what you do. And that is initially what I had to do 7 years ago, was I had to think of me, and I had to think of my children, and blood doesn't mean everything. It really doesn't. Sometimes you have to cut that off to better your life and your children's lives, and that doesn't make you a bad person, and it doesn't reflect who you are. It really does show how strong you can be, and that I think that would be my biggest like goodbye like phrase to leave off of is someone else's struggles don't define who you are.
Very, very good words to close out on. Thank you for coming. And to everybody
Yeah.
else, make sure you tune back next time for another episode of Butler's Babble. And remember, if anybody asks, say the Butler did it.